She stood barely 5'4" and weighed 125 pounds. The soldiers rushing toward her were twice her size and trained for combat. Logic said she didn't stand a chance. Logic was wrong. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing for more tales of unrecognized heroes. Staff Sergeant Rebecca Torres had been assigned to Fort Braxton's military police unit for exactly 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, she had processed endless stacks of paperwork, directed traffic at the main gate during rush hours, and endured countless jokes about her size from fellow MPs who seemed to find her presence more amusing than professional. At 25 years old, she was the smallest MP on the base, standing just over 5 feet tall and weighing barely 125 pounds soaking wet. Everyone made sure she knew exactly where she stood in the pecking order. "Torres, you sure you can handle that clipboard?" Sergeant Miller had asked that morning, his voice dripping with condescension as he leaned against the duty desk. His comment earned hearty laughs from the other MPs gathered around the coffee machine. "Maybe we should get you a booster seat for the patrol car. Or better yet, maybe you should consider transferring to the kindergarten on base. I hear they need someone your size to supervise nap time." The jokes had been relentless since her arrival. Every shift brought new comments about her stature, her quiet demeanor, and her apparent inability to handle the physical demands of military police work. Some questioned whether she had only gotten through MP school because of lowered standards. Others wondered aloud if she was related to someone important who had pulled strings to get her the assignment. Rebecca had smiled politely and continued her work, filing reports with meticulous care and maintaining her equipment to spotless standards. She had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than words, and she knew that her time would come. Patience had been one of the first lessons her father had taught her, both in life and in leadership. It came sooner than anyone expected, and in a way that would change everything at Fort Braxton forever. The incident started during what should have been a routine training exercise on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in August. The temperature had reached 95 degrees, and the humidity made everything feel like a steam bath. Tensions were already high due to the oppressive heat and a recent series of budget cuts that had affected training schedules and equipment maintenance. Bravo Company had been conducting crowd control simulations in the main training yard, practicing formations and riot control techniques that every soldier needed to master. The exercise was designed to test their ability to maintain discipline under pressure and work as a coordinated unit. However, things began to go wrong when tempers flared between 2 platoons over a disputed call made by the exercise evaluators. First platoon claimed that second platoon had broken formation during a crucial maneuver, while second platoon insisted that first platoon had failed to follow proper communication protocols. What began as heated words and pointing fingers quickly escalated into aggressive shoving and personal insults. Years of rivalry between the units, competition for resources, and pent-up frustration from months of intense training had finally reached a boiling point. "You idiots wouldn't know proper formation if it bit you in the ass," shouted Corporal Williams from 1st Platoon, his face red with anger and heat exhaustion. "At least we don't need our drill sergeant to hold our hands during every exercise," Private Johnson from 2nd Platoon shot back, stepping forward aggressively. The situation deteriorated rapidly from there. What started with 2 soldiers soon drew in others as unit loyalty kicked in. 12 soldiers from different platoons converged in the training yard, their voices rising to shouts, their gestures becoming more threatening. Fists began flying as months of competition and testosterone finally exploded into pure, uncontrolled aggression. The carefully planned training exercise had spiraled completely out of control. The drill instructors, who had been observing from the sidelines and taking notes on performance, suddenly found themselves dealing with a full-scale riot. They tried to intervene, shouting commands and blowing whistles, but the soldiers were beyond listening. Years of pent-up tension, combined with the brutal heat and stress of constant training, had created a powder keg that had finally detonated in spectacular fashion. Bodies crashed into each other with sickening thuds. Dust clouds rose from the ground as soldiers grappled and rolled. The sound of combat boots scraping against concrete mixed with grunts of exertion and the occasional cry of pain as punches found their marks. Blood began to appear on faces and uniforms as the violence escalated. Lieutenant Davis, the officer in charge of the exercise, stood frozen for a moment as he watched his carefully planned training session dissolve into chaos. Then his training kicked in, and he frantically began calling for backup on his radio, his voice tight with stress and urgency. "Base Command, this is Lieutenant Davis at Training Area Charlie. We need additional MPs to the training yard immediately. We have multiple soldiers engaged in physical altercation. Repeat, we have a situation spiraling out of control. Request immediate assistance." The radio crackled with static before the response came back. "Copy that, Lieutenant Davis. Dispatching available units to your location. ETA 5 minutes. 5 minutes felt like an eternity as Davis watched the situation continue to deteriorate. More soldiers were joining the fray, drawn by the commotion and their loyalty to their respective units. What had started with 12 had now grown to include nearly 20 soldiers, and the violence was spreading like wildfire. Rebecca Torres was the first to respond to the call. She had been completing routine vehicle inspections in the motor pool, checking tire pressure and fluid levels on the patrol cars when the urgent radio transmission came through her handheld unit. The desperation in Lieutenant Davis's voice was unmistakable, and she could hear the chaos in the background even over the radio static. Without a moment's hesitation, she dropped her clipboard with its neatly organized inspection forms and ran toward the commotion. Her boots pounded against the concrete as she sprinted across the base, her equipment belt jangling with each step. Other MPs were also responding, but they were coming from farther away, and Rebecca's position in the motor pool put her closest to the training area. As she rounded the corner of Building 47 and came within sight of the training yard, the scene that greeted her was one of absolute chaos. It looked like something from a war zone rather than a training exercise. 12 soldiers were engaged in multiple fights, scattered across the dusty ground, their uniforms torn and dirty. Some were wrestling in the dirt, rolling and grappling for advantage. Others were throwing wild haymaker punches with the kind of desperate fury that comes from pure adrenaline and rage. Blood was already visible on several faces, dark stains against the tan and brown of their camouflage uniforms. Private Martinez had a split lip that was bleeding freely down his chin. Corporal Jackson was nursing what looked like a rapidly swelling black eye. The sounds of combat filled the air, grunts of exertion, the slap of flesh against flesh, the scrape of boots against concrete, and the occasional curse or cry of pain. The drill instructors stood at the perimeter of the chaos, clearly unsure how to safely intervene without escalating the situation further or risking injury to themselves. They were shouting commands that were being completely ignored, their voices lost in the din of combat. Master Sergeant Rodriguez looked particularly frustrated, his face red as he bellowed orders that might as well have been whispered for all the attention they received. Lieutenant Davis saw Rebecca approaching and immediately shook his head with vigorous disagreement. His expression was a mixture of concern and disbelief as he took in her small stature compared to the large, violent men she was running toward. "Torres, wait for backup," he called out, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "This is too big for one person, especially—" He didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was crystal clear to everyone within earshot. A small woman had no business trying to stop 12 angry, trained soldiers who were already beyond the reach of reason and military discipline. Rebecca heard his words but ignored them completely. She walked directly toward the center of the melee with a sense of purpose that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her. She didn't reach for her baton, which hung unused at her side. She didn't call for her radio to request additional backup. She didn't even raise her hands in a defensive position or adopt any kind of fighting stance. She simply walked with calm determination into the middle of 12 angry, fighting soldiers, as if she belonged there and had every right to be commanding their attention. Private Johnson, a 200-pound infantryman from Texas with arms like tree trunks and a chest built from years of hard physical training, was in the middle of grappling with Corporal Williams when Rebecca stepped directly between them. Johnson looked at her with a mixture of confusion, and barely controlled anger, his face red with exertion and streaked with sweat and dust. A thin trickle of blood ran from his split lip where Williams had managed to land a solid punch. "What the hell are you doing, lady?" Johnson demanded, his voice hoarse from shouting and fighting. "Get out of here before you get seriously hurt. This isn't your fight, and you have no business being here." Rebecca looked up at him with complete calm, her voice steady and clear despite the chaos surrounding them on all sides. The contrast between her quiet composure and the violent frenzy around her was striking. "Step back, soldier." Johnson actually laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that cut through the noise of the ongoing fights. "Are you serious right now? You're going to tell me what to do?" He took a step toward her, his fists still clenched and ready for combat, blood trickling from his split lip onto his uniform. "Look at yourself, sweetheart. I weigh twice what you do, and I've been training for combat since before you could probably spell army. You need to step aside and let the real MPs handle this." The condescension in his voice was thick, and several other soldiers had stopped their own fights to watch this confrontation unfold. They were clearly expecting to see Rebecca back down, call for help, or simply be pushed aside like an obstacle in Johnson's path. That's when Rebecca did something that no one expected, something that would be talked about at Fort Braxton for years to come. She didn't back down or show any sign of intimidation. She didn't call for help or reach for any of the equipment on her duty belt. She didn't adopt a defensive posture or prepare for physical confrontation. Instead, she took a deep, measured breath, planted her feet firmly on the ground with the stability of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, squared her shoulders with military precision, and spoke in a voice that cut through the chaos like a hot knife through butter. "Company, halt!" The command voice that came from her small frame was unlike anything anyone had ever heard in their entire military careers. It wasn't loud in terms of sheer volume, but it carried an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs, deeper than her chest, deeper than her very being. It was the kind of voice that demanded immediate and unquestioning obedience, the kind that spoke to something primal and fundamental in every soldier's training and conditioning. The voice carried the weight of generations of military tradition, the authority of countless drill instructors who had shaped young civilians into disciplined soldiers. It was a voice that spoke directly to the part of every soldier's brain that had been programmed to respond instantly to proper command presence, regardless of the source. The effect was instantaneous and absolutely stunning. All 12 soldiers froze mid-action as if someone had pressed a cosmic pause button on the entire scene. Fists that had been flying stopped in mid-swing, suspended in the air. Wrestling holds were immediately released. Shouting ceased so abruptly that the silence seemed to ring in everyone's ears. Every head turned to look at this small woman who had just commanded the attention of an entire riot with nothing but the power of her voice. The contrast was surreal. Moments before, the training yard had been filled with the sounds of violence and chaos. Now it was silent, except for the heavy breathing of exhausted soldiers and the distant sound of a helicopter conducting training exercises somewhere else on the base. But Rebecca wasn't finished. Not even close. "Attention!" Again, that voice cut through the air with undeniable authority, carrying the full weight of military tradition and command presence. It was the voice of every drill instructor who had ever shaped a recruit, every sergeant who had led soldiers into battle, every officer who had commanded respect through sheer force of personality and leadership. One by one, like dominoes falling in perfect sequence, the soldiers snapped to attention. Their bodies moved automatically, years of ingrained training overriding their anger, confusion, and exhaustion. Backs straightened, heels came together, eyes focused forward, hands dropped to their sides in perfect military bearing. Even Johnson, who had been laughing at her and questioning her authority moments before, found himself standing at perfect attention without even thinking about it. The transformation was remarkable to witness. These weren't just soldiers anymore. They were the embodiment of military discipline and training, responding to proper command authority exactly as they had been taught from their very first day in uniform. Rebecca walked slowly among them, her boots clicking against the concrete in the sudden silence. Her eyes met each soldier's gaze with unwavering confidence and authority. She moved like someone who had every right to be there, every right to command their attention and respect. Her presence filled the space around her despite her small physical stature. "You are United States soldiers," she said, her voice now at normal volume but carrying the same weight and authority that had stopped the riot. "You wear the uniform of the greatest military force in the world. You have sworn an oath to defend this nation and uphold the values that uniform represents. Act like it." The silence that followed was complete and profound. 12 grown men, all larger and stronger than Rebecca, all trained for combat and warfare, stood perfectly still and silent, waiting for her next command like students waiting for their teacher's instruction. The power dynamic had shifted completely in a matter of seconds. Lieutenant Davis stared in amazement from the perimeter, his mouth actually hanging open slightly as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. The drill instructors looked at each other in complete disbelief, their years of experience having never prepared them for anything quite like this. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been shouting himself hoarse trying to restore order, stood silent and impressed. "Private Johnson," Rebecca said, turning to the soldier who had challenged her authority and questioned her right to be there. "Yes, ma'am," he responded automatically, his voice crisp and professional. All trace of condescension had vanished completely, replaced by the respectful tone of a soldier addressing a superior. "What is the first general order of a United States soldier?" Johnson's voice was steady now, all trace of aggression and hostility completely gone. He recited the words he had memorized in basic training. "To take charge of this post and all government property in view, ma'am." "And what does that include, Private?" "The conduct of all personnel in my area of responsibility, ma'am." Rebecca nodded approvingly, her expression serious but not harsh. "Corporal Williams?" "Yes, ma'am." "What is the definition of military bearing?" Williams stood even straighter than before, if that was possible. "The way a soldier conducts themselves in public and in uniform, maintaining dignity and professionalism at all times, ma'am." "Outstanding." Rebecca's voice carried approval, but also a clear expectation that this standard would be maintained. "All of you, extend and recover. You are soldiers of the United States Army, not street fighters looking for a brawl. You have dishonored your uniform, your service, and yourselves today. Return to your units for reflection and consider what it truly means to wear that uniform." The 12 men moved as one, executing perfect about faces in unison and marching away in formation with military precision. Their movements were crisp and professional, a stark contrast to the chaotic violence of just minutes before. The transformation was complete and stunning. The angry mob had become disciplined soldiers in the span of 2 minutes, all through the power of one woman's voice and commanding presence. Lieutenant Davis approached Rebecca slowly, shaking his head in wonder and disbelief. His expression was a mixture of amazement, respect, and confusion as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. "Torres, where the hell did you learn to do that?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine awe. "I've never seen anything like it in 15 years of service. I've seen officers with 20 years of experience who couldn't have handled that situation half as well." Rebecca picked up her clipboard from where she had dropped it earlier, dusting it off calmly as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. "My father was a drill instructor at Paris Island for 20 years, sir. Command voice was literally the first thing he taught me, even before I could properly tie my shoes or ride a bicycle." "Your father?" Lieutenant Davis's curiosity was piqued. "Who was your father, Torres?" "Master Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Torres, sir. He trained Marine drill instructors for 2 decades and served in 3 combat deployments." Lieutenant Davis's eyes widened in immediate recognition. Carlos Torres was a legend in military circles, a man whose reputation preceded him wherever Marines gathered. His command voice was said to be so powerful it could stop a charging bull in its tracks. Stories of his ability to control entire battalions with just his voice were legendary throughout the Corps and had been passed down through generations of Marines like folklore. You're Carlos Torres's daughter? The Carlos Torres who trained at Quantico? Yes, sir. Why didn't you mention this before? Why didn't you put any of this in your personnel file? Rebecca shouldered her gear and straightened her uniform with practiced military precision. Respect isn't inherited, sir. It's earned through actions and character, not bloodlines or family connections. I wanted to prove myself on my own merits. As word of the incident spread throughout Fort Braxton like wildfire, carried by the soldiers who had witnessed it and the drill instructors who couldn't stop talking about it, Rebecca found her reputation transformed overnight. The same soldiers who had mocked her size that very morning now spoke of her with genuine respect and admiration. The MPs who had joked about her clipboard and suggested she needed a booster seat now sought her advice on crowd control techniques and combat situations. The story grew with each telling, but the core facts remained the same. A 125-pound woman had stopped a riot involving 12 soldiers without throwing a single punch or even raising her voice beyond what was necessary to command attention.